morning. There behind the Mount of Beatitudes with those white plastics, you can look back up beyond that ridge, and in the background you see Mount Hermon. And here we have an Episcopalian community from Houston, Texas, having their morning service here at sunrise in Magdala. That light now is, in a way, different, and I don't want to say better or less better than when the sun is shining there, because it's all uniform. You see, the exact same light all across the window, reflecting from pre-sunrise. So we have a very rich palette of inspirations from the readings this morning. The sea is really stirred up here. I find the readings are kind of stirred up as well. I'm kind of stirred up from the experience of the wedding still. Stunned in a way by human relationships, by all relationships. You know, Jesus said in the last line of the gospel today, it's very powerful. He who receives you receives me. And he who receives me receives the one who sent me. I was just thinking, when I was a child and my mother sent me with the pork steak or the freshly made butter to the neighbors, and instead of welcoming me and receiving the butter, they set the dogs on me and sent me back. What would my parents think of that when I would come back and tell them that the neighbors sent the dogs after me and chased me away, and they were sending me with a gift? They were sending me with a gift of the latest produce from the farm. To them. So my parents would obviously feel deeply offended and hurt. He who sends you sins. He who receives you receives me. And if we think about this, it has very, very vast implications for our relationships. You know, what stunned me at the wedding is I didn't choose that this marriage happen. That was the decision made by the bride, my niece, and her husband. It wasn't something I chose. And I'm sure there were people encouraging them, but even those people didn't choose it. Their own siblings, their parents, their friends. But that wasn't my decision. But now I'm connected to all those people. Isn't that amazing? And those people are significant for me now because they're the immediate relatives, in-laws of my niece. And so we're connected. And it's no longer indifferent what happens to them, and if their grand aunt passes away, then I go to the funeral if I can, if I'm there. If it's possible, if I'm over here, it's another story. But that's if I had showed up at the funeral a year ago for a similar person in the family, I would be a total stranger. But now I'm related because her grandnephew is married to my niece. And so we're connected. And he who receives you receives me. Were I to shun one of that family, then that would impact a lot of people. How deeply we're connected. And actually this goes very well with all the relationships that are in the readings themselves today, because we have an incredible story. I was blessed to be in Cyprus twice on, let's say, a kind of pilgrimage. Usually we try to get to see a neighboring biblical land when we are here, when we have down season, which is before Christmas. And that brought us to Egypt and a few times, and to Jordan and to Lebanon. You know, Jordan is just down there. If we go down to the end of the lake, you can see Jordan at the very end of the lake. That's already Jordan, the country of Jordan. Down there at the very end. And then Lebanon, you know, we've often pointed it out, it's right to my back. Well, actually, when we saw Mount Hermon this morning, we saw a bit of Lebanon, because Mount Hermon is on the border between Syria, Lebanon, and Israel today, right up there behind the palm tree trunk. And if you go right beyond that in the distance, you see that Mount Hermon, but also all along the mountains here, that you can see in the distance, way over the restaurant. Say a prayer for the restaurant, because we're hopefully going to continue the construction of it soon. You see the mountains there in the background. That's the border with Lebanon. And so getting to know the biblical lands is good, because it helps us, after living here for so long, to understand also the connection between all these countries, the relationship in God's plan. So we have today a very interesting story, and I only discovered that in our last visit before Christmas to Cyprus, that when Paul sails from Paphos and ends up in Antioch, it's actually not a total coincidence. Because in the story of Paul in Cyprus, which is a fascinating place, he gets to meet the governor. The governor wanted to see him. The governor heard all about him, he's preaching and so forth, and the governor wants to see him. So Paul meets with the governor, and there's a fellow there that tries to block that encounter and spoil it. But the next thing we see is Paul is on his way to Antioch. Well, guess what? The governor, whose name is Sergio Paulus, he is appointed by the Roman Emperor, obviously, to be the governor of Cyprus. His family is based in Antioch, in Pisidia, in modern-day Turkey. So here we see relationships, recommendations, and probably Sergio Paulus talked about his family in Antioch, and Paul heads off there. Isn't that a marvelous thing? And you see, the great gifts we have of the scriptures, the great gifts we have of our faith, has been brought to us through relationships. It didn't fall out of the sky like a piece of stardust. It came through relationships. It's not good for men to be alone. And that foundational line is also speaks a lot of truth about marriage, about family, about friendship. And the tasks of life, the challenges of life, and the joys and fulfillment of life. To be together, to share. Sorrows shared is said, there's the sun right over the horizon right now. Sorrows shared are said to be sorrows divided, minced meated. And so joys shared are joys multiplied. That's why you invite people to a party, to a wedding, to a celebration, to a birthday party. That's why you invite them, to share the joy, to multiply the joy. And that's why we all go to a funeral, because when the people experience grief and loss, so good that other people come and share the loss. It lifts the burden, it shares the burden, it lessens the pain. We're not alone. And we could ask, how did Paul ever get to Cyprus? Well, because of Barnabas. And why would he go with Barnabas? Well, Barnabas went to get him and bring him back to the community. Paul needed time alone as he was converted. He needed time alone for silence. He needed to process all that had happened, like pilgrims do on a pilgrimage. They need time alone, silent time. It's good to hear teaching, it's good to hear preaching, it's good to pray together, but we also need time alone, processing the experience. Time alone. How important is time alone? Another little fascinating detail is, it's a theory of modern scholarship, that probably Paul, he was called Saul, right? But now he assumes the name Paul. And people surmise that it's actually probably because of Sergio Paulus. When the famous Scipio, the Roman general, conquered Africa, he assumed the name Africanus. So when Paul now calls himself Paulus, it means that, he's kind of the fisher of men who brought in Sergio Paulus into the Christian community. Or we can hear Father Bill from here. At this distance, he has a great voice. But the wind is also helping. It's coming from the east this morning. That's why the lake is so stirred up. Bathed in light, listening to God's word at the Sea of Galilee. The great value of relationships. Did you ever make a child? Sometimes people use that expression. I find it a little repugnant, or a lot repugnant. You don't make a child. A child is a gift. When a child comes into your life, to welcome a child, and Jesus said that also. He said, if you welcome this child, you welcome me. Or a spouse. Did you make your spouse? And did you make your spouse your spouse? No, there's a whole lot of gift there. There's the gift of your spouse who said yes. And just like the sunrise behind every gift is a giver. So is there any human relationship we have that's not being given to us? Our siblings. Did you make your siblings? And even if some relationships have gone sour, they're still given to us, because it's impossible to undo the relationship. What God has joined together, let no man put asunder. We always hear that applied because of its original context in the situation of marriage. But actually, maybe there's a little bit more to that. Maybe it applies to all relationships. My mother will always be my mother for all eternity. My father will always be my dad. My brother will always be my brother. relationships. They're gifts. Okay, friendships can go sour. Very profound, intimate, personal relationships can go difficult, but there's still history there. And that's amazing, listening to Paul speaking in the synagogue in Antioch and the different places he went, and the way he tells the story of his people, our fathers' fathers. And they were so long in the desert, in the wilderness, 40 years. They were 450 years in Egypt. It's really amazing to see that when you read that the words today of Paul's presentation in the synagogue that we have in the reading, you're stunned at the fact that he has such a dominion of the history of his people, because that's his people. It's his relationships. Do we know our own people's history and their trials and sufferings and joys? What an incredible gift that is to us. That constitutes us as a people. The whole thought of cancellation culture is very difficult because we can't cancel people. And even if they did bad things, they're still my brother. They're still my sister. They're still my people. And maybe we have cause for shame, for humility, but they're my people. And also the great accomplishments, the great joys, the great adventures. The people who built the house we live in, the streets we drive on, the food we eat. What a great treasure to rediscover human relationships. And no wonder then, since God is love and we are created for love, that we should love one another. It just fits so well together. It's not the fight of the fittest, the victory of the fittest, the battle among each other. The battle is for love, for charity, for victory of the human family, of all these relationships. People, let us be thankful for what we have, wonderful gifts. Every human being, every relationship. See you later, alligators.